Good morning, everyone. And as Andrew has indicated, this is the, as I call it, the 7th day of the second session of phase 1 and final day. And we will follow the order as set out in the schedule provided to us. Just one note that Mr. Annavale has had someone deliver his outline to us, and it's here on the podium. I'm not sure how we'll get it to you, but it's available here. Okay. Mr. Kussner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes. Thank you. Mr. Chair, we have prepared some written closing submissions, as well as a draft order, which we'll be addressing in our submissions, and which both of which have been circulated to all of the other parties. And Mr. Kahar will be handing up hard copies for the tribunal. We also have one case that we'll be referring to in the course of our submissions. And we have copies for the tribunal as well, and electronic copies have been circulated to the parties. Yes. Mr. Chair, our intention is to use these written submissions more or less as a roadmap for our oral submissions this morning. We've tried to avoid diving too deep into the actual evidence. We expect that the tribunal has taken fairly detailed notes over the course of the hearing. There's also the YouTube video to supplement recollections of evidence that was provided. So we're going to try to stick to the high points as they relate to the items that we've covered in these submissions. So turning to page 1, this was, of course, a hearing of appeals of 3 different matters: the secondary plan, the implementing zoning bylaw, and a related appeal by TSMJC in respect of some of the policies that it still had under appeal in relation to the Part 1 official plan. And as far as the secondary plan itself is concerned, you heard that it was adopted almost 3 years ago by City Council. It's taken a long and complicated route to get to this hearing today. But in our submission, by the time we got to this hearing, you had before you a comprehensive policy framework for an updated secondary plan and implementing zoning bylaw. It went through a fairly extensive public review and stakeholder consultation process, both originally in 2017 and again following the tribunal that was granted by this tribunal in 2019. It led to a staff report with recommendations by city staff that were endorsed by City Council. It has the support of York Region as the upper tier municipality, as well as the TRCA. And subject to agreed modifications, it has the consent of all but one of the landowners within the KDA for the purposes of this phase 1 hearing. The remaining objectors at this hearing consisted of only one KDA landowner, that's Mr. Streisfield's client, North Elgin Properties, Inc. in the Northeast Quadrant, as well as 2 groups of residents who reside in the neighborhoods adjacent to the KDA, one being the YRA, Mr. Cherniak's client, and the other being Mr. Iskander. You heard the evidence about the Part 1 official plan, originally adopted back in 2010, appealed to the former board in 2011, and following a succession of partial approval orders, settlement hearings, and contested hearings, most of it's now in full force and effect with only a handful of remaining appeals, one of which, of course, is the TSMJC appeal, which still has certain policies under appeal on either a site-specific or KDA-specific basis. Other policies, some of those policies are the subject of a partial settlement, which we'll be requesting that the tribunal approve as part of its order. Other policies were withdrawn by TSMJC as part of that settlement, with the result that they will come into force as adopted without further modifications. You've heard the evidence that the Part 1 official plan involved a fundamental or paradigm shift in planning for the future growth of the city. Other than a handful of remaining greenfield areas approved for traditional subdivision development, the urban area is now almost completely built out. So the Part 1 OP, which is entitled Building a New Kind of Urban, called for significant mixed-use intensification with identified centers and corridors, primarily focused along major arterial roads and principally along Yonge Street, the city's main spine, with a major focus on transit-oriented development and improving the public realm, especially within these intensification centers and corridors. You heard that the Part 1 plan establishes a hierarchy of intensification areas, starting at the top with the Richmond Hill Center at Yonge and Langstaff or Highway 7, which is the city's designated urban growth center under the growth plan, where the highest degree of intensification is planned for. Next in the hierarchy are the two KDAs, one centered around Yonge and 16th Avenue, the other being this one centered around Yonge and Bernard Avenue, a short distance north of Elgin Mills Road. The Part 1 OP places these two KDAs second and third in the overall intensification hierarchy. You heard that once the critical mass of the Part 1 plan was in effect, the city embarked on the process of bringing forward secondary plans for the various intensification areas as directed by the Part 1 plan. This KDA was one of the first to move forward because there were significant intensification pressures within this KDA and several development applications that had been filed. You heard about the interim control bylaw that was enacted by council for the lands within the KDA in 2016 to facilitate a comprehensive planning study. That led up ultimately to the secondary plan and implementing zoning bylaw that were brought forward in 2017. The interim control bylaw was subsequently upheld on appeal to the board, and by operation of law under Section 38, that ICBL remains in effect today for most of the KDA lands, which underscores the sense of urgency that was expressed by a number of the landowners to try to bring forward a comprehensive policy framework through this secondary plan and implementing zoning bylaw as expeditiously as possible. So following the study and consultation process that you heard about, the original secondary plan and implementing bylaw were adopted by council back in 2017. It was exempt from approval by York Region, and it was subsequently appealed to the tribunal by various landowners in all four quadrants and by one single resident outside of the KDA, Mr. Iskander. You heard that the hearing was originally scheduled about a year ago in July 2019, but in November of 2018, a new council was elected. Shortly after that, it decided to want to facilitate greater intensification across the city than its predecessor and greater than what the Part 1 OP adopted in 2010, but based on studies back as far as 2008, had called for. At the time, the city had two secondary plans that were under appeal before this tribunal. This one and the downtown local center secondary plan. In the latter case, council effectively pulled the plug, repealed the entire secondary plan, and decided to start the whole process over again. In this case, however, council decided to take a different approach. In June of 2019, it requested an adjournment so it could, in my term, press the pause button on the approval process, engage in a further consultation and review process, and bring forward proposed modifications for recommendation by staff, hopefully endorsement by council, and ultimately consideration by this tribunal, all for council's stated purpose of facilitating greater density and heights within the KDA and determining an appropriate policy and zoning framework for those densities and heights. The adjournment was granted for that purpose back in June of 2019. That adjournment request was supported by all of the appellants other than Mr. Iskander, and the hearing was rescheduled for June, July of this year. We then had the further consultation and stakeholder engagement and review process for the secondary plan update. You heard that the city also commissioned an external traffic and transportation consultant to undertake a peer review and update of the study that had been done by BA Group prior to the original secondary plan in 2017. They were asked to undertake a parking and traffic update to determine how much additional intensification could be accommodated and to make recommendations on appropriate standards for parking and traffic management. And as you've heard, those recommendations ultimately included a holding bylaw regime under Section 36 of the Act to ensure that the additional density contemplated by the secondary plan that they were prepared to support was appropriately phased and supported by the required traffic and transportation infrastructure on a region-wide basis. The proposed modifications to the secondary plan, zoning, and related Part 1 OP policies came forward in the May 2020 staff report. They were ultimately endorsed by Council on May 14th with no further modifications. And in a number of instances subsequent to that, further modifications to the secondary plan and Part 1 policies were negotiated with various appellants and parties, and full or partial settlements were agreed to. And it's those proposed modifications which was the basis for the evidence presented to the tribunal at this hearing, and which the city and most of the other parties to this hearing seek to have this tribunal approve. Just to mention in passing, during the course of this hearing, you also heard evidence and argument about an earlier resolution that had been adopted by Council on May 13th, by which it endorsed the staff report subject to a series of other proposed modifications. But that resolution, as you heard, was rescinded in its entirety on May 14th, and it therefore has no legal status. On that basis, this tribunal ruled that it should have no regard to it at all, nor to anything else that was considered by Council on that day under Section 2.1 of the Planning Act. And again, as far as the May 14th resolution is concerned, since that meeting took place in closed session, the city acknowledged that there were no materials before Council to which this tribunal could have regard under Section 2.1. You also heard about the motion that was brought by YRA prior to this hearing to preclude the hearing from proceeding on certain objections to the tribunal's jurisdiction, both procedural and substantive. That motion was heard on June 16th, dismissed in its entirety that day by Vice Chair McCooch, with written reasons that were subsequently provided on June 29th. And in our submission, the decision and order of June 29th was instructive for a number of reasons, including the direction it provided to this panel on which issues were appropriate for determination of the Phase 1 hearing, which issues were appropriately deferred to the Phase 2 hearing. That decision and order from June 29th also included a number of key findings made by the tribunal, including, notably, the finding that the modifications to the secondary plan, which are now proposed by the city, do not have the effect of changing the essential nature and character of the secondary plan, reference to paragraphs 72 and 73 of Vice Chair McCooch's decision. That finding was further supported by the opinion evidence you heard at this hearing from Ms. Anderson, and in my submission, there's been no planning evidence provided to this tribunal to suggest otherwise. It's the city's submission that with the proposed modifications that were recommended by staff and endorsed by Council, and subject to the additional modifications that have been agreed to with various other parties, the secondary plan continues to provide a comprehensive, consistent, and sound planning policy framework for mixed-use intensification in all 4 quadrants of this KDA. In addition, it's our submission that the proposed modifications to the plan and zoning bylaw now include a holding bylaw regime under Section 36 to ensure that the necessary traffic and transportation infrastructure will be in place prior to allowing any development within the KDA, including successive thresholds beyond 10,400 persons and jobs within the KDA. Collectively, it was the evidence of the city's planning, urban design, and transportation witnesses that these policies and the implementing zoning provisions will serve to ensure that the build out of the KDA over an extended period of time proceeds on an orderly and phased basis without undue impacts on existing and proposed development, both in and around the KDA from a traffic and transportation standpoint. You've also heard, for greater certainty, the proposed holding regime also includes a fail-safe mechanism designed to ensure that the requisite infrastructure is in place for all development within the KDA, both before and after the various thresholds have been reached. By having the holding regime in place for all development, thereby requiring all development applicants to include studies and reports demonstrating that their proposed development can be accommodated from a traffic and transportation standpoint, even before and after the successive thresholds in the holding bylaw have been met. Just by way of summary, the evidence called on behalf of the city and the other parties in support of its case, the city called professional witnesses qualified in land use planning, urban design, transportation planning, and engineering. The first was Dana Anderson. She initially provided factual non-opinion overview evidence, as well as her planning opinion evidence to close out the city's case in chief and reply. Notably, all but one of the other land use planning experts who testified at the hearing were generally supportive of her evidence. The only planning expert who took issue with any of her opinions, and the only one to testify on behalf of any of the objecting parties, was Mr. Minette, and I'll address his evidence a little later in these submissions. The second was a panel consisting of Mr. Krzyzewski, City's Director of Development Engineering, and Mr. Wong of HDR, who provided opinion evidence on transportation planning and engineering on everything other than parking, and Mr. Dahl and Mr. Chai, who provided their expert opinion evidence from a parking standpoint. Once again, the city staff person provided evidence from a policy standpoint, and the HDR staff member did so from a technical standpoint. You also heard from Eldon Theodore, I'm sorry, I said HDR, he's also of MHBC, who provided expert opinion evidence in the field of urban design, primarily as it relates to the height regime, but also on a number of other urban design matters. Notably, the tribunal did not hear evidence from any other urban design witness except for the brief limited evidence you heard from Mr. Pereira on behalf of NEC. To the extent you did hear from him, his opinion was generally supportive of Mr. Theodore's opinions, particularly in relation to height and the city's proposed modifications. As far as the evidence called by the other parties, there were a total of 7 remaining appellants and 4 additional parties other than the city. Of those 11 parties, 2 of them did not participate in this phase 1 hearing. Their issues, 70 Bernard and Mr. DePede, were deferred on consent to the phase 2 hearing. Of the remaining 9 parties, 2 were public authorities, the region and TRCA, who supported the city's position in its entirety. 3 landowner appellants within the KDA, Yonge MCD, Doliola, and 10870 Yonge Street, or Longos Plaza, all with lands on the west side of Yonge Street in the northwest and southwest quadrants. They supported the city's position and proposed modifications in their entirety. And you heard that Longos Plaza entered into minutes of settlement filed as Exhibit 9, which deal only with matters of clarification and interpretation and do not require any further modifications to either the zoning bylaw or the secondary plan. 2 of the parties were landowner appellants in the northeast and southeast quadrants, NEC and TSMJC respectively, both of whom effectively support most of the policy regime proposed by the city, but seek greater density as well as other more permissive policies respecting their own lands. In the case of TSMJC, they were willing to defer all of their remaining contested issues to the phase 2 hearing, with the result that they did not have to contest any of the evidence presented by the city and other parties in support of the secondary plan or zoning bylaw. Unfortunately, NEC was not prepared to do likewise. 2 of the parties are residents within the neighborhoods adjacent to the KDA, one being Mr. Iskander, the other being the Incorporated Residents Association, YRA, which is a party sheltering under Mr. Iskander's appeal. And as you heard, they both fundamentally oppose the densities and heights now proposed by the city within the KDA, as well as certain other policies dealing with roads and other issues. And notably, the only evidence provided on behalf of the residents from anyone who was qualified to provide expert opinion evidence was that of Mr. Seagobin on behalf of the YRA, and Mr. Kahar will address his evidence a little further on. As far as the KDA landowner parties are concerned, you heard that there was only one who took issue with various aspects of the secondary plan in this phase 1 hearing, and that was Mr. Streisfield's client, NEC. And in our respectful submission, their position effectively amounted to cherry picking those policies they like and rejecting the ones they don't like. They have no current development application at the city, and as you've heard, it will have free rein to seek modified or different policies for their own lands in the Northeast Quadrant on a strictly without prejudice basis in the Phase 2 hearing. Despite that, and despite the fact that the same opportunity was sufficient in the TSMJC's case to scope their issues and defer them to Phase 2, NEC steadfastly refused to scope their issues, persisted in seeking to challenge certain policies and provisions on a KDA-wide basis, to the point where its attempts to do so often contravened rulings that had already been made by this panel on multiple occasions. And I noted here remarkably, in all such instances where NEC purported to oppose policies on a KDA-wide basis, not a single one of the other KDA landowners to whom those policies apply had any concerns themselves respecting those policies. Not one of them shared the concerns expressed by Mr. Minette, NEC's planner, that the proposed secondary plan policies, which he professed to be seeking to make even better, that they would make for an inefficient planning process or what he called a negative planning outcome. And respectfully in our submission, this amounted to a case of NEC and its planner professing to know better than anyone else, better than the owners of other KDA lands, better than the expert consultants retained by those owners, what policies are appropriate to enable successful intensification of their lands. Mr. Chair, the evidence before this panel established that there were compromises made by virtually all other KDA landowners in an effort to reach a mutually acceptable settlement with the city that was consistent with good planning and the policy framework. But in the case of NEC, respectfully, it was always a case of my way or the highway. The one limited exception was their willingness during the hiatus between July and September to have a belated experts meeting between Ms. Anderson and Mr. Minette. That ultimately resulted in a handful of additional Part 1 policies and secondary plan policies being settled as between them. But beyond that, there was no indication of any willingness on the part of NEC to achieve consensus and middle ground, as this tribunal actively encourages. And that stands in sharp contrast with every other KDA landowner, particularly Yonge MCD and Doliola, both of whom, unlike NEC, do have active development applications, and both of whom were willing and able to make concessions or adjustments that rendered their developments fully policy compliant with the city's proposed modifications in all respects. With respect to the evidence that you heard from the land use planners, it's our respectful submission that in relation to the evidence from Mr. Minette on behalf of NEC and Ms. Anderson on behalf of the city, where their opinions differed, this tribunal should prefer the evidence provided by Ms. Anderson in all respects. And I say that for several reasons. Firstly, as you've heard, Ms. Anderson's evidence was fully consistent with and supported by the evidence provided by all of the other land use planning experts who testified at the hearing, including Mr. Guder, Mr. Coe, Mr. Lowe, Mr. Folletta, and Mr. Swinton. Her opinions respecting key policies and plans such as the PPS growth plan, the regional OP, and the Part 1 OP were balanced and had due regard for all of the often competing planning priorities. By contrast, it's our submission that Mr. Minette's evidence was unduly focused on specific policy priorities that were of particular concern to his client, and for which, to use Mr. Streisfield's term yesterday, he advocated on behalf of his client, such as efficiency, low-cost housing, and as-of-right permissions. And he often did so, in my submission, at the expense of the broader policy objectives which this secondary plan seeks to advance as part of its stated purpose, vision, and principles in a manner that conforms with the Part 1 official plan. Secondly, it's our respectful submission that Mr. Minette's evidence in many respects was characterized by undue rigidity, inflexibility, and inconsistency. And that included policies respecting the Bernard bus terminal, respecting the potential future signalized intersection on Yonge Street north of Bernard, respecting stratification of roads within the KDA, and TDM measures. And just by way of example, It was his opinion that a secondary plan should study in advance and plan conclusively for a future signalized intersection rather than leave it open for future determination depending on whether a future study establishes that the signal is warranted at that time. And in our submission, his opinion in that regard, like his opinion on all the other above issues, is simply untenable as a matter of sound long-term planning, and was, as Mr. Kahar will address, in many respects inconsistent with the evidence of his client's own transportation expert, Mr. Chan. The third point I wanted to note here, remarkably in my submission, it was Mr. Minette's opinion that the lifespan of this secondary plan should only be considered to be 10 years, 11 years to 2031. And the city respectfully submits that in this respect, his view is contrary to both the intent of the growth plan and the planning work that's been done for the secondary plan itself. And the uncontested evidence you heard that full build out of the KDA is likely to take place over a much larger time horizon. And in our submission, the short-sighted consideration by Mr. Minette of a very limited time horizon, which was based solely on the current time horizon of the Part 1 official plan, without regard for the planning work that's already underway at the regional and local levels to comprehensively review and update their respective official plans to bring them into conformity with the 2019 growth plan. That informed and in my submission unduly colored Mr. Minette's opinions regarding appropriate planning policies for the build out of the KDA and the additional studies required for implementation of those policies. And I noted here, somewhat ironically, given the respective time periods they had to familiarize themselves with the policy context and the planning issues, it's our submission that Ms. Anderson's evidence was actually more balanced, more thoughtful, more considered, and more grounded in sound planning principles and policies than that of Mr. Minette. And for that reason, it's our submission that this tribunal should prefer the evidence of Ms. Anderson, as well as the consistent evidence provided by all of the other planning experts who testified over any contrary evidence provided by Mr. Minette. Turning now to our summary of the evidence on an issue-by-issue basis. And just to be clear, it doesn't purport to be an exhaustive catalog of every issue before you. We've sort of placed them into certain categories, which in our view were the primary focus and the key issues for adjudication. The first one deals with the proposed density regime in the secondary plan and zoning bylaw. And as we've submitted here, the starting point is that the density to be determined as appropriate for the KDA must be premised first and foremost on consistency and conformity with provincial plans and policies and matters of provincial interest. That, of course, is mandated under the policy-led system implemented through the Planning Act. And as noted by Ms. Anderson and the other planning experts who testified, that includes planning for intensification through and I've quoted here from the PPS, efficient development patterns that optimize the use of land, resources, and public investment in infrastructure and public service facilities. Particular emphasis is placed in both the PPS and the growth plan on development that is transit supportive, and that's defined in the PPS to mean development that makes transit viable, optimizes investments in transit infrastructure, and improves the quality of the experience of using transit. It often refers to compact mixed-use development that has a high level of employment and residential densities in proximity to transit stations, corridors, and associated elements within the transportation system. And that's from page 52 of the PPS. Those same themes are similarly embodied in the 2019 growth plan, including section 2213C, provide direction for an urban form that will optimize infrastructure, particularly along transit and transportation corridors, to support the achievement of complete communities through a more compact built form. In section 3232B, prioritizing areas with existing or planned higher residential employment densities to optimize return on investment and the efficiency and viability of existing and planned transit service levels. So in effect, Mr. Chair, Madam Chair, the policy framework in terms of the growth plan and the PPS mandate this symbiotic relationship between higher order transit and high intensification in designated intensification areas and corridors. And in my submission, this secondary plan ticks off the boxes in both of those categories. And as the tribunal heard, the proposed density regime for this KDA now includes an overall maximum FSI of 4.0 for the KDA as a whole, with prescribed maximum densities for the three designated character areas. The first, the corridor character area along Yonge Street, contemplates individual site densities up to 5 FSI. The second, the interior character area, an intermediate density of up to 3 for development further removed from the Yonge Street corridor. And the third, adjacent to the neighborhoods, being the neighborhood character area that would permit very limited heights of 3 stories around the outer perimeter to ensure appropriate transition to the adjacent neighborhood lands. You heard evidence that the planned density of up to 4 FSI for the KDA as a whole represents an increment of 33% relative to the maximum of 3 that was prescribed for both of the 2 KDAs back in the 2010 Part 1 official plan and carried forward in the original adopted 2017 secondary plan for this KDA. And that additional FSI, the 33% increment, would all be subject to the proposed holding regime, as would, for that matter, all of the FSI proposed even up to 3.0. And in the context of changes to the provincial and regional policy context that have taken place since 2008, when the planning for the Part 1 OP was originally undertaken, that was some 12 years ago. It includes a 2019 growth plan, which now directs planning authorities to plan to a 2051 time horizon rather than 2031. And it's the city's submission that this represents a relatively modest increment, one that is wholly justified for a KDA along the primary regional corridor, and one which is planned to be one of the 3 most intensely developed intensification areas in Richmond Hill. You heard that the densities now proposed for the KDA were opposed by several parties. Only 2 of the parties opposed the densities on the grounds that they were excessive. Those were Mr. Iskander and the YRA. Notably, neither party called any professional planning evidence in support of their position. In the case of YRA, it did call evidence under summons from Patrick Lee, the city's director of policy planning, and one of the authors of the May 2020 staff report. While he did candidly acknowledge that he had some concerns with a number of the underlying assumptions that were used, such as reliance on information supplied by the region regarding average unit sizes, ultimately it was his professional opinion that those concerns did not undermine the validity of their analyses and the conclusions they provided. And in my submission, overall, his evidence was measured and convincing and generally consistent with the evidence provided by all of the other planning experts who testified. Mr. Chair, the city acknowledges that the densities now proposed for lands within the KDA are in some instances greater than the densities that were proposed by various KDA landowners at the time the original secondary plan was adopted in 2017. You heard the evidence that was elicited by Mr. Cherniak in that regard. But it's our respectful submission that in the broader policy context of this secondary plan review, the appropriate starting point is what constitutes good planning for achieving the intensification objectives as part of a consistent and comprehensive policy framework across the secondary plan area. And that determination of good planning in our submission, based on the evidence you heard from the city's witnesses and the other professionals who testified, that should always consider and seek to accommodate legitimate development aspirations of individual landowners, but on the basis that in a policy-led system such as ours, the policy should lead and not follow. Once those planning and design principles have been established on a secondary plan-wide basis, concept plans should, of course, endeavor to comply with them, just as other proposed developments within the KDA have done. But as a matter of good planning, it should not be the role of the KDA secondary plan and bylaw to be guided by an owner-specific concept plan, especially one that was prepared at a particular moment in time prior to the completion of the comprehensive secondary plan review, and then require the plan and implementing zoning to be adjusted to suit those concept plans. And more fundamentally in our submission, the exercise should always be a forward-looking one, not a backward-looking one. And in our submission, it's also noteworthy that the smaller unit sizes that are of concern to the YRA are precisely the type of units that are most likely to fulfill the policy objective in the regional OP and the Part 1 OP to provide a minimum of 35% affordable housing. Keeping the maximum density at 4.0 FSI, based on the evidence you've heard, would in our submission better enable the city to achieve that objective in a balanced and phased manner. Conversely, reducing the density to address perceived concerns about insufficient traffic and transportation infrastructure would only hamper the city's ability to satisfy that affordable housing objective, all for the sake of addressing concerns that in our submission are already covered off through the detailed holding bylaw regime and the fail-safe mechanisms built into it that continue to apply both before and after the various thresholds have been met. And it's also our submission, based on the evidence you've heard from both Mr. Lee and Ms. Anderson, that because the thresholds built into the proposed holding regime are now tied to residents and jobs rather than FSI, the extent of any discrepancy between current and assumed unit sizes and any uncertainty in that regard is effectively rendered irrelevant at all stages of development. And Mr. Kahar will address that a little further below. You heard evidence on behalf of the YRA from John Lee, its president, and in our submission, he frankly did a commendable job for a lay witness of analyzing data from various sources in an effort to substantiate and his concerns regarding the densities proposed in the secondary plan. However, and with all due respect to Mr. Lee, his lay evidence suffered from a number of frailties that became evident on Mr. Kahar's cross-examination, and I've summarized them here. Firstly, in terms of his analyses of the major transit station areas currently proposed by the region, it failed to account for the fact that these are currently just that. They're proposed draft MTSAs that are under consideration as part of the region's ongoing MCR process. In the interim, planning for the MTSAs is to be guided by the definition in the growth plan itself. Namely, MTSAs are generally defined as the area within an approximate 500 to 800 meter radius of a transit station. And as was noted in the May 2020 staff report, within a 500 meter radius of the Bernard BRT station, the planned density now proposed for the KDA would represent an overall density across that 500 meter radius of 220 residents and jobs at full build out, substantially less than what was envisioned or suggested by Mr. Lee's analysis. Mr. Lee also acknowledged that even within the draft MTSA that's now proposed by the region, in this instance, approximately 60% of the land area falls outside of the KDA boundary. That 60% includes areas that are constrained in whole or in part in terms of future development opportunities. They include existing low density areas within adjacent neighborhoods, open space areas, lands currently being used for commercial development along the regional corridor well beyond the KDA boundary, which are unlikely to be developed at a density and scale anywhere close to what's proposed for the KDA itself. It also became apparent on cross-examination that Mr. Lee's analysis of the Yonge-Eglinton secondary plan in Toronto was based on the original adopted version, not the final version, which was approved by the minister and which contains substantial modifications. It also became apparent on cross that Mr. Lee's comparison of the population density proposed in this KDA to the other geographic code areas across Canada was in many respects a flawed apples and oranges comparison. It compared the planned population of the KDA at full build out 2041 or beyond to the existing population of those areas based on census data that's already 4 years old. It compared a KDA which is itself comprised of several geographic codes with other areas that in many instances were substantially larger and likely included lower density areas as well. It ignored the fact that this KDA is planned and designated as an area for substantial intensification, again, one of the 3 most intensely developed areas in Richmond Hill, whereas other areas might have been fully built out already under an earlier planning regime and have limited planning or physical opportunities for additional intensification. His analysis of unit sizes ignored the evidence provided by Mr. Lee and others that there is no straight line correlation between unit sizes and number of occupants. And for example, the example Mr. Kahar put to him, 2 smaller bachelor units could well have fewer occupants collectively than 1 larger 2-bedroom unit. And lastly, Mr. Lee's concern about potential population in excess of the 12,600 residents and jobs at the highest threshold under the proposed holding regime ignores the fact that this figure already incorporates a significant reduction in combined residents and jobs when compared to the thresholds that were recommended by HDR. I also noted here that both Mr. Anderson and Patrick Lee opined that in the event it becomes apparent at a future point that the planned density for this KDA is excessive in relation to the planned infrastructure, or for any other reason for that matter, that density is by no means cast in stone. There is always an opportunity to revisit it on that basis. It was suggested by Mr. Cherniak in his cross-examination, I believe, of Mr. Lee, that there is some sort of prohibition against reducing the permitted density of development once it's been approved. In our submission, based on the evidence you heard, the only policy that comes close to that sort of prohibition is section 2246 of the growth plan. That provides that within major transit station areas on priority transit corridors or subway lines, land uses and built form that would adversely affect the achievement of the minimum density targets in this plan will be prohibited. So it's tied to the minimum density targets. And given that the planned density for this KDA is likely to exceed the province's minimum density target for the MTSA of which it forms part, and by a significant margin by YRA's own evidence, it's our submission that any future reconsideration of the planned density within this secondary plan area is unlikely to engage that prohibition. And lastly, on this point, it's our submission that the position that was taken by the YRA in relation to the planned density for this KDA entails an underlying assumption that the planned density requires a determination that the density is needed in order to meet provincial or regional growth targets. And it's our respectful submission that there is simply no such test of need under either the PPS or the growth plan. And on the contrary, the growth plan itself expressly provides in the introduction at page 9, the policies of this plan represent minimum standards within the framework of the provincial policy-led planning system. Decision makers are encouraged to go beyond these minimum standards to address matters of importance unless doing so would conflict with any policy of this plan. And that, of course, was one of the guiding principles that led the review process undertaken by the city, culminating in this proposed revision to the secondary plan. It's our submission that the incremental density now proposed by the city for this KDA represents a balanced and appropriate implementation of that provincial policy direction. Turning to the proposed height regime, one of the most notable changes arising from the city's proposed modifications is a movement away from regulating height in terms of a specific maximum number of stories, except in the neighborhood character areas where there continues to be a maximum of 3 stories to ensure an appropriate fit and transition with the adjacent neighborhoods, but otherwise to do so in favor of a more flexible policy-led approach by which maximum height is determined by reference to compliance with the 45-degree angular plane requirement and other built form policies such as maximum floor plate size. These are policies that are already prescribed within the Part 1 official plan, and those would operate in combination with the maximum density permissions in the secondary plan to regulate height. And the evidence you heard from the city's professional planning and urban design witnesses, Ms. Anderson and Mr. Theodore, was that these policies impose some very practical constraints on the building heights that are theoretically achievable under the angular planes alone. It was their evidence that this is a preferred approach to regulating height, one which fully complies with all applicable planning and urban design principles, and one that's consistent with best practices and current approaches to urban design in other municipalities across the GTA. Their evidence was consistent and supported by the evidence of Patrick Lee, who testified to the challenges of justifying the use of what he considered highly subjective height criteria, such as maximum number of stories. And he opined that the use of technical, objective, and widely accepted standards, such as a 45-degree angular plane, were more appropriate and justifiable from a policy standpoint. And in addition to affording greater flexibility and accommodating the specific opportunities and constraints of individual sites, the use of those criteria could also facilitate the perceived advantages of having fewer taller buildings rather than a greater number of shorter buildings. And we've noted here that the city's proposed height regime was fully supported by all of the KDA landowners, not opposed by any party except the neighborhood residents. The evidence in support of the modified height regime that the city was proposing that the YRA was proposing with a maximum of 25 stories along the Yonge Street corridor. In our submission, that was premised primarily on their concerns that the additional height opportunities afforded by the city's proposed modifications would enable developers to use John Lee's term, to break the density of 4.0 FSI rather than on the basis of actual urban design considerations. And it's our respectful submission that this concern about breaking the density, quote unquote, is fully answered by the proposed holding bylaw regime, as we've discussed, and as we'll discuss a little further below. So with that, Mr. Chair, Madam Chair, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Kahar, who's going to address sections C, D, E, and F in this part of our submissions.
Thank you, Mr. Kussner. So regarding the proposed holding bylaw regime, subject to certain minor and limited exceptions, the secondary plan provides that no development can occur within the KDA without the approval by council of an application to lift the proposed holding symbol, which would apply to all of the KDA lands and at all stages of development of the KDA. Such an application would be subject to several requirements that are explicitly set out in the bylaw. And in particular, I want to focus on a transportation planning study and a transportation demand management strategy. Those have to be provided. Also, a functional servicing report that needs to be provided. And accordingly, built into the H conditions is an additional series of checks and balances to ensure that any proposed development within the KDA can be supported by the transportation infrastructure required to support it, which a proponent is going to have to establish when they lift their H and provide the municipality, the city, a transportation planning study and a transportation demand management strategy. Also built into the H conditions is a further check and balance by way of a functional servicing report. The proponent is going to have to establish that there is available servicing infrastructure to support their proposed development. Simply put, the proponent cannot establish that the existing transportation and or servicing infrastructure in the Yonge Bernard KDA is sufficient to propose for their proposed development. They just can't proceed. In addition to this, when the number of residents and jobs within the KDA exceeds 10,400 or 3.0 FSI, there are even further criteria that need to be met before development can proceed. These criteria are supported by the analysis undertaken by the city's transportation engineering witness, that's Carl Wong of HDR, and include 4 scenarios that require, to varying degrees, certain regional roads to be completed, projects rather to be completed in the surrounding road network, that the KDA has a certain minimum transit modal split, for there to be certain minimum transit modal splits along Bayview and Bathurst, and or certain road winding improvements to be made to Bathurst Street. Collectively, the purpose of these additional criteria is to ensure that the assumptions made by HDR to support more than 10,400 residents and jobs, or 3.0 FSI, and up to 14,150 residents and jobs, or combined, or 4.0 FSI, in the KDA are in place before development proceeds that would cross that respective combined residents and jobs threshold. The BA report from 2017 and the subsequent peer review and update undertaken by HDR support 10,400 residents and jobs and a 3.0 FSI in the KDA. But what is also notable is that all of the transportation experts you heard from in this hearing, and that includes Mr. Anil C. Gobin, called by the YRA, and Mr. Nixon Chan, called by the NEC, they all agree that the transportation infrastructure proposed for the KDA, it can support 10,400 residents and jobs and a combined 3.0 FSI. That point is not disputed. We're good with 3.0. Only Mr. Chan and Mr. C. Gobin provided the tribunal with deferring opinions on transportation issues that I submit are inconsistent with the city's position. So in a nutshell, Mr. Chan opines that the KDA does not require all of the proposed roads and traffic signal infrastructure identified in the secondary plan to develop up to 4.0 FSI. So he's not really taking any issue with the proposed holding regime, although admittedly, Mr. Manette, NEC's planner, disagreed with him on that point. I think Mr. Chan's view was that you could have 4.0 FSI within the Yonge Bernard KDA, but you could achieve it with a lot less transportation infrastructure in the form of fewer public road connections and fewer signalized intersections. In the city's submission, Mr. Chan's evidence stands alone on this point, and the city submits that the basis for his opinions did not withstand scrutiny under cross-examination, as I will further elaborate on in my oral submissions. Mr. Seagoben, on the other hand, agreed that all of the road and traffic signal infrastructure that the city is proposing and as identified in the secondary plan are required, but he did not believe that the conditions to exceed 10,400 residents and jobs, or 3.0 FSI, could be achieved. So for example, he didn't think the transit modal splits were realistic. Mr. Seagoben also questioned some of the assumptions used to calculate traffic volumes, included that 3.0 FSI is the most that is supportable in the KDA. Now, while Mr. Seagoben may disagree with whether the conditions in the proposed holding regime can ever be satisfied, it's our submission that this is not really a problem for the tribunal in terms of approving the proposed holding regime. And we say that because let's say the tribunal approves the holding bylaw regime and Mr. Seagoben is subsequently right. He's right. No harm results. All it would effectively mean is that the criteria in the proposed holding bylaw regime is not satisfied, with the result that the incremental density between 3.0 and 4.0 is simply not attainable in the KDA. But conversely, if Mr. Seagoben is wrong and the tribunal has approved the proposed secondary plan and holding bylaw regime, well, that's a good thing, because what it's then done is it's approved additional intensification that can rely on the available transportation infrastructure. And that is precisely what provincial and regional plans and policies direct this tribunal to do. Moreover, to the extent that Mr. Seagoben disagrees with some of the traffic volume calculations for development beyond 3.0 FSI, his opinions should not be preferred because they are based on what I say are unrealistic assumptions. And that was confirmed by the reply evidence of Mr. Wong. In any event, it must be borne in mind that all of the transportation witnesses who are testifying, they're assessing whether transportation infrastructure will be sufficient to support the full build out of the KDA within the 2041 timeline. They're crystal balling 20 years from now. And they're making assumptions, and those assumptions are inherently subjective. And in the city's submission, the best safety against this is precisely what the city's proposing, which is an additional series of checks and balances through a transportation planning study required to be filed at the time a proponent seeks to lift the H on its lands. That could be now, after the secondary plan is approved, or that can be 20 years from now. The YRA, through its lay witness, John Lee, also raised a concern that the combined population and jobs in the KDA could exceed 14,150 within a 4.0 FSI. And he basically says that that could happen because you could have smaller unit sizes, which could potentially prevent more residents. The city submits this concern is unfounded because the unit sizes used in the city's analysis were in fact not smaller than the average size unit, because the city's unit sizes included amenity areas. In any event, it is unclear whether smaller units would result in more residents. All of this is in any event in our submission a red herring, because as we've already indicated, any development in the KDA is always subject to the requirement that a development applicant provide a transportation planning study that would have to determine whether the proposed development could be accommodated in the KDA from a transportation infrastructure perspective. There's also been some suggestion from the YRA that the overall maximum persons and jobs limit should be imposed in the secondary plan, although there was no evidence directly called on this point. There were submissions made by Mr. Cherniak. The city submits that Ms. Anderson's opinion on this point should be preferred on the basis that it is not supportable from a land use planning standpoint to impose that type of maximum limit. Moving on to the proposed road network. You heard a lot of concern raised by NEC regarding the so-called ring road, which through Mr. Chan, they say does not exist because the ring road needs to be connected at all points. It is undisputed that neither the Part 1 OP nor the secondary plan uses the concept of a ring road as part of the city's road classification system. And it was effectively a shorthand reference used by city staff to describe the fine-grained public road network and connectivity that is proposed in the secondary plan. As such, what the NEC was doing was nothing more than a case of setting up a straw man of a ring road so that it could then knock it down. On cross-examination, NEC's own transportation witness, Mr. Chan, admitted there's nothing in the secondary plan that identifies the proposed fine-grained road network as a ring road. In any event, there was considerable evidence called from the other transportation experts, as well as NEC's own planner, Mr. Manette, which confirmed that what is depicted in the secondary plan could be understood to be a ring road, even if there ends up being no continuous connectivity at all points. So for example, the location of the potential signalized intersection, if that's not connected, notwithstanding, it's still colloquially a ring road. The concerns regarding whether a ring road is present in the secondary plan is therefore in our submission, another red herring. There was also a concern raised regarding whether the new road links identified in the secondary plan could actually be acquired by the city. Notably, not one of the KDA landowners on the west side of Yonge Street opposes the proposed road network. And when development applications are filed for these lands, the city will secure ownership of the required public roads. In some instances, in fact, these roads are already proposed to be provided as shown on the Yonge MCD and Doliola development applications. On the east side of Yonge Street, only NEC is opposed to the proposed road network at this phase 1 hearing, with TSMJC agreeing to defer its concerns to the phase 2 hearing. The city submits that if any of the road links are required earlier than a respective development application proceeding, it's always open for the city to negotiate with the landowner to purchase the lands. And of course, the city also has its expropriation powers. There was considerable evidence called in opposition to the potential signalized intersection. Again, that's the one at the intersection of link D and E, adjacent to NEC's lands. And that was called, notwithstanding the tribunal's ruling that this was a phase 2 issue. NEC opposes this potential signal. And the point its council repeatedly made is that this potential signal cannot be accommodated because it would require a break in the BRT rapid way. Through Mr. Chan, it also raised a concern that the signal would not meet the region's guidelines on intersection separation distances. However, on cross, Mr. Chan admitted that this signal is planned as a potential signal and that it may or may not materialize at a time a development application is filed. The region could proceed with this potential signal irrespective of whether it is shown in the secondary plan, and the region retains the authority to approve the signal with intersection separation distances that are lower than its guidelines. And in fact, you'll recall the region's transportation witness, Mr. Ryan Wong, opined that there are instances where this has actually already occurred. And in this instance, it is required because the stream corridor to the north acts as a constraint to where the signal could be located. Identifying the potential traffic signal in the secondary plan also acts as notice in effect to the adjacent landowners that the region may be seeking this signal in the future. In the city's respectful submission, providing this notice to landowners, that's good planning. Failing to do so, poor planning. Even if the tribunal decides not to approve this potential signalized intersection in the secondary plan, that doesn't preclude the region from proceeding with the signal at a future point in any event. As both a planning and a legal matter, the tribunal isn't really approving the potential signalized intersection. Instead, it is providing the region and the city through the secondary plan a further tool to protect for the possibility of the region exercising its statutory authority to approve it in the future. As for the design of the BRT, which of course is currently under construction, it can be modified over the 2041 time horizon, and there was substantial evidence called to that effect. NEC's contention to the contrary, that the BRT somehow precludes the potential signalized intersection and or the connection at Link D, is wholly unfounded as an evidentiary matter. The BRT is not the Great Wall. There was also recognition by many of the transportation experts who testified that private roads with public vehicular, pedestrian, and cycling access could substitute for public roads. The city has recognized this in further modifications to the secondary plan that are before you, where it now acknowledges that the use of stratified public streets or private streets with public access easements for vehicles, pedestrians, and cyclists. There are specific criteria that need to be met, and of primary importance is a council-approved policy permitting the use of stratified public streets or private streets for such purposes. NEC's land use planner, Mr. Minette, opined on this policy and sought to redraft it so that stratified roads and private roads with public access are permitted without any restriction or condition whatsoever. And that was curiously notwithstanding that Mr. Minette himself agreed that, in fact, some of the criteria that was in the city's policy was appropriate to approve. In the city's respectful submission, the tribunal cannot order the form of road the city may take, whether it be stratified or a public access easement. Further, without a council policy regarding stratification, there are several unanswered questions that would need to be answered, including who owns the strata, who is responsible for maintenance, liability, cost share of capital improvements, and so on. There would also be a need to have a consistent policy across the city regarding stratification of roads. The city is engaged in this stratification study. It's in progress. There's no reason why the secondary plan cannot be approved in the absence of this study, with further details regarding how stratified roads / public access easements will be utilized in the KDA to be determined through council-approved policy. Regarding the parking policies, of all the parties to the Phase 1 hearing, only NEC raised any issue with the parking rates proposed by the city for the KDA. It persisted in doing so despite the fact that its parking concerns had already been ruled to be site-specific and therefore a matter to be deferred to the Phase 2 hearing. Nevertheless, NEC persisted on several occasions in its attempts to ignore the tribunal's ruling on this point. The city respectfully submits that any evidence attempted to call on this issue should be disregarded by this tribunal for the purposes of the Phase 1 hearing. The city did lead evidence for Mr. Jonathan Chai and Mr. Jason Dahl, Mr. Chai from HDR, Mr. Dahl from city staff, both in support of the parking policies and regulations contained in the secondary plan and the implementing bylaw. Despite the contention by NEC, the city does indeed have a parking strategy, citywide and for the KDA. That's the city's 2010 parking strategy, which recommended parking rates for key development areas that were lower than those for the rest of the city. The city is now in the process of reviewing its parking strategy and is currently engaged in the 2020 parking strategy and TDM strategy for new developments. Now, the rates that are proposed in the KDLA zoning bylaw are reflective of an interim position. They're lower than what is contained in the 2010 parking strategy and may be further lowered once the 2020 parking and TDM strategy project is complete. The parking rates proposed reflect a reduced rate for all types of uses, including apartment dwellings, that was determined based on a best practices review of rates used in other municipalities. This was supported by evidence from Mr. Chai of HDR. Also, the implementing bylaw is set up in a way that the parking rates may be further reduced on application once a proposed TDM strategy is submitted as part of a development application. So the principle here and the approach taken requires an application to further reduce the rates. And the reason for that is to allow further flexibility to proponents in choosing which TDM strategy works best for their proposed development and site-specific constraints. That said, the holding regime under the secondary plan makes it a mandatory requirement for the submission of a transportation demand management strategy. Much has also been said by NEC regarding zero-car households and its connection with affordable housing. However, it is notable that because the proposed parking rates are well below 1.0, and because the TDM measures in the secondary plan allow for the unbundling of parking spots, in effect, the secondary plan and zoning bylaw already allow for zero-car households to be created. NEC was also critical of the approach taken in the secondary plan and zoning bylaw toward TDM measures related to parking. Its preferred approach, as we understand it, is to have all of the TDM measures to be specifically implemented in the bylaw, and consequently the lower parking rate to be baked into the bylaw. However, this approach reduces flexibility, and for that reason, it was considered and rejected by city staff and HDR in favor of a case-by-case approach through site-specific development applications, wherein the specific development, site, unit type, and count are known. And in that instance, the appropriate TDM measures can be considered and an appropriate rate can be assigned to the development. The city submits that NEC's approach is not appropriate for a secondary plan that has to plan comprehensively for varying sites, planning contexts, varying development conditions, and varying applications. In the city's respectful submission, NEC's real underlying concern is about getting the parking standard it wants for its lands without having to file any formal development application. The city's view is that the standards should be set KDA wide in this instance and provide that where applications are filed, lower rates may be considered on a case-by-case basis according to TDM strategy. It is also notable that all of the KDA landowners on the west side of Yonge Street, and that includes two that actually have active development applications, Doliola and Yonge MCD, they support the city's proposed parking standards as contained in the implementing bylaw. Regarding policies respecting the Bernard Bus Terminal, the Bernard Bus Terminal constitutes existing infrastructure in the KDA. Its location is both known and shown in the secondary plan. The secondary plan's policies recognize that in the future, there is a potential for redevelopment of the Bernard Bus Terminal, and that could occur either at its existing location or at another location within the KDA. The proposed policies rightfully recognize that such a decision may be made in the future and potentially through an environmental assessment if one is required, and of course with consultation with the Transit Authority and all other stakeholders, ensuring maximum utility and efficacy of the service over the long term. It is notable that almost all parties have settled on these policies related to the Bernard Bus Terminal, and that includes TSMJC as owner of the lands where the terminal is currently located, the region, the city, and other KDA landowners who could be affected by it. But once again, the lone holdout is NEC. Despite NEC's contention, there's no reason for the location of a potential redevelopment of the Bernard Bus Terminal to be fixed today. Doing so would in fact limit options for redevelopment of the Bernard Bus Terminal, and that would not be consistent with good planning. Not knowing the location of the potential Bernard Bus Terminal redevelopment is not an issue for development proceeding in the interim, and that is because it does not in any way freeze other lands from being redeveloped. The policies in the secondary plan also recognize that the owner providing the land to the region for the redevelopment of the Bernard Bus Terminal shall be reasonably compensated for the fair market value of the land using all funding mechanisms available. In the city's respectful submission, that is a fair and reasonable policy. And Mr. Chair, I'm now going to hand it back to Mr. Kussner.
Thank you, Mr. Carhart. Mr. Chair, turning to the proposed policies dealing with parkland. In our submission, there was a very thorough and comprehensive assessment of parkland needs, which was undertaken by city staff as part of the proposed modifications that were recommended in the May 2020 staff report. And that assessment and the resulting recommendations were wholly supported by the evidence you heard from both Ms. Anderson and Mr. Theodore. And in particular, at pages 27 to 29 of the staff report, there is a very detailed assessment of the current and planned parkland available, all within a 5-minute walking distance around the KDA, including an accompanying map that depicts it. And on that basis, staff were readily able to conclude that the opportunities available from a parkland standpoint are consistent with the city's 2013 Parks Plan. The linear parks contemplated within the KDA itself would enhance access to those existing and planned parks that lie just outside the KDA boundary. The staff report further noted at page 15 the recent planning approvals by City Council respecting parkland and the location of parks within the KDA. These included the South Brookside Tertiary Plan adjacent to the northwest quadrant of the KDA. And you heard through the evidence of Mr. Gooder on behalf of Yonge MCD that this was implemented in part through the April 2020 decision and order of the tribunal, Mr. Conti's decision, approving the development application by Yonge MCD for its lands adjacent to the KDA. And that included a linear park along the natural heritage system adjacent to the watercourse. The council approvals also include lands along the western edge of the KDA in the southwest quadrant in proximity to Canyon Hill, which were secured by the city as part of a council-approved development application made by Doliola for its proposed townhouse development in 2017, and that will have the effect of expanding the existing toll bar park in the immediate vicinity of the KDA. You heard about the movement from urban squares in the original 2017 plan to urban plazas in the current proposed modifications to the plan. It's our submission that both from a planning and functional standpoint, from the evidence you heard, there is no substantive distinction between the urban plazas now contemplated and the urban squares previously contemplated. Both could be either publicly owned or privately owned in the form of POPs, and both serve substantially the same purposes as articulated in the secondary plan. And as you heard from the evidence, in addition to the policy requirements for linear parks and urban plazas, development within the secondary plan still remains subject to the parkland dedication or cash in lieu requirements prescribed by Section 42 of the Act, Section 3.1.8 of the Part 1 plan, and the city's parkland dedication bylaw. Collectively, these will provide further opportunities for the city to secure additional parkland at suitable locations through the development approval process. And in our submission, it's notable that there was no evidence provided by any of the professional witnesses who testified to suggest that the parkland and recreational open space policies in the proposed secondary plan would not be sufficient to meet the recreational needs of KDA residents, employees, and visitors. The only evidence you heard to that effect was provided by John Lee. Once again, it's the city's respectful submission that his lay evidence on that issue was selective, and understandably, because he obviously feels quite strongly about this, it did not provide a balanced and objective consideration and assessment of all of the parks and open space opportunities available to meet the needs of KDA residents, employees, and visitors. And I noted that among other things, on cross-examination, it became apparent that Mr. Lee did not appear to have any awareness or understanding of the POPs policies in the secondary plan. I wanted to just comment briefly on the issue of further studies, which was one of the prominent themes during the course of this phase 1 hearing. There were concerns raised by a number of the objecting parties respecting the need for additional citywide studies to be completed in connection with certain of the secondary plan policies, such as stratification, parking, and affordable housing. You also heard concerns mostly from the YRA that the secondary plan is proposing to fix permitted heights and densities for this KDA prior to the completion of the region's comprehensive review or the city's review of either its official plan or proposed secondary plans for other intensification areas like the Richmond Hill Center. And in both respects, the underlying concern was that bringing the secondary plan forward for approval now at the heights and densities now proposed amounted to prematurity, as advocated by the YRA, or alternatively, the proposition that the secondary plan policies should be fixed now without regard for any studies that are currently underway on a citywide basis, as was advocated by NEC. And we've noted here that while the YRA's position was at least consistent in this regard, it's our submission that NEC's position was inconsistent and contradictory from one day to the next. On the one hand, they insist upon the need for what Mr. Minette referred to as of right zoning as part of the secondary plan process. On the other hand, just yesterday, there was the suggestion that it was premature to bring forward an implementing zoning bylaw until the required studies had been completed, as was the case with the city approved secondary plans for the 2 remaining greenfield areas in North Leslie and West Gormley. And in both respects, the city commends to the tribunal the evidence you heard from Ms. Anderson, as she noted, particularly in regard to the proposed policy 124427, which contemplates a citywide stratification study, one which is already underway. It is common for secondary plans to ensure that a policy which may have implications in other areas are duly considered through a council-approved policy to ensure appropriate and consistent policy direction on a citywide basis rather than on an ad hoc case-by-case basis. And in our submission, this is of particular importance in the context of a policy respecting stratification, which contemplates an encumbrance being placed on public roads that are under municipal ownership. And it's our respectful submission that as a matter of law, this tribunal does not actually have the statutory jurisdiction to force a municipality to accept an encumbrance on a public road or other public lands. That's a jurisdiction that can only be exercised by the council itself through its authority under the Municipal Act and other statutes dealing with lands under municipal ownership and control. And that's precisely why, and sorry, just before I leave that point, I've handed up a decision of the divisional court in a very off-cited case known as Madame Rouge Limited in the City of Toronto. I don't purport to take you through that decision. It has been referred to and relied upon on repeated occasions by this tribunal and other court decisions, and it stands for the proposition that I just advanced, that this tribunal does not respectfully have the statutory jurisdiction to require a municipality to accept any form of encumbrance on a public road or any other public lands. Only the council itself can authorize that. And that's precisely why, for instance, you heard that the city has a parkland policy in section 3.1.8 of the Part 1 plan that includes a section dealing with potential stratification. And this is precisely why when it came to those stratification policies, which were approved by the former OMB as part of the Part 1 OP approval, the approved policy leave it to council to consider accepting stratified title to parklands where certain criteria can be demonstrated to the satisfaction of council. That's precisely why we're proposing that a similar approach be taken in this instance with respect to any proposal for stratification of roads within the KDA. The proposed stratification policy itself, 124427, which was agreed to by the city and TSMJC and accepted by all other parties except NEC, it duly acknowledges and respects that legal limitation and the respective jurisdictions of this tribunal and a municipal council. By contrast, it's our submission that the modified policy that Mr. Minette was advocating would effectively force the city to accept encumbrances on public roads against the will of council. Worse yet, his proposed policy is worded as a mandatory one, which requires stratification in all circumstances with no built-in flexibility at all to consider its appropriateness depending on the specific circumstances of a development application and no criteria at all to guide the application of such a policy. And again, apart from the questionable legality of such a policy, it's our submission that that would manifestly be a case of poor one-size-fits-all planning at its worst. The city also commends to the tribunal the opinion evidence provided by Ms. Anderson respecting compliance with all of the prescribed requirements for a secondary plan as set out in section 5.1.5 of the Part 1 plan. You heard that these include the assessment of opportunities and constraints, opportunities, needs, and constraints, which was undertaken by Urban Strategies back in 2017 as part of its preparatory work for the original secondary plan. And it was Ms. Anderson's opinion that that analysis remains current today and was sufficiently comprehensive for its intended purposes. There was no contrary evidence in that regard provided by Mr. Minette. Moreover, it was Ms. Anderson's opinion that the proposed secondary plan clearly established the proposed development concept for this KDA as required by 5.1.5D of the Part 1 plan, both through the narrative provided in the secondary plan and the illustrations and diagrams depicting the intent of those development policies. And with respect to Mr. Minette's opinion to the contrary, it's our respectful submission that it simply strains credulity to suggest that a reasonably informed person reading the secondary plan as a whole would be unable to gain a clear understanding of the form of development which it contemplates. Indeed, no other professional planner who testified before this tribunal expressed that concern. I just wanted to refer briefly to the draft order that the city has prepared. It was circulated to all of the parties with revisions based on comments that they provided. I believe the form of the draft order is acceptable to all of the other parties with the possible exception of Mr. Iskander, perhaps Mr. Streisfield. I don't propose to take you through it chapter and verse, but perhaps if you could turn it up. The operative part of the order starts on page 3 of the draft, and it's in the tribunal's standard form. It notes in the third paragraph, and those matters having resulted in the tribunal deciding to approve with modifications those portions of the KDA secondary plan without yellow highlights and or not specifically noted as deferred at the phase 2 hearing, as set in Appendix A, those portions of the zoning bylaw with the similar notation as set in Appendix B, and certain policies in the Part 1 plan as set in Appendix C. And these correspond to Exhibits 73, 74, and 75, which were filed with the tribunal just yesterday. We will be providing up-to-date versions of those 3 appendices should the tribunal see fit to approve them in that form and append them to the draft, to the proposed order. So we then get into the operative part of the order, consistent with what's set out in that paragraph and consistent with what is proposed to be deferred to the phase 2 hearing as noted in each of the 3 appendices. And we then get down to the last part of the order, which starts toward the bottom of page 4. And what we've done here, Mr. Chair, is taken the without prejudice language that was originally suggested and incorporated into Mr. Makuch's June 29th decision. We've expanded on it a bit further just for greater certainty and to clarify the precise nature of the without prejudice approval. And we've broken it out into 4 subparagraphs that clarify the nature of the without prejudice approval. And it states, for greater certainty and without limiting the foregoing, firstly, no party may take the position that because the tribunal has resolved an issue and or approved certain policies and schedules or zoning provisions and schedules on a KDA-wide basis in the phase 1 hearing, that the same issue cannot have a different resolution and or different policies, provisions, or schedules approved on a site or quadrant specific basis as they apply to those lands that remain at issue in the phase 2 hearing. And secondly, the tribunal's decision respecting those issues, policies, provisions, and schedules as approved in the phase 1 hearing shall not be considered in any way to be a disposition of same for purposes of those matters remaining at issue in the phase 2. Thirdly, no party shall be precluded from taking substantially the same position in respect of a given policy, provision, or schedule remaining at issue on a site-specific or quadrant-specific basis in the phase 2 hearing, as that party took in respect of the same issue, policy, provision, or schedule in the phase 1 hearing. And lastly, any decision by any party to not raise a particular issue or not oppose a particular policy, provision, etc., in the phase 1 hearing does not in any way preclude that party from raising the same issue or opposing the same policy provision, etc., on a site or quadrant specific basis in the phase 2 hearing, provided, of course, the matter has been determined to be a matter for adjudication in the phase 2 hearing, and that party has expressly reserved the right to do so prior to, and we've added or during the phase 1 hearing to accommodate the request that was made by Mr. Cherniak during the course of this hearing. And lastly, it provides that the tribunal can be spoken to in the event of any issues in terms of implementation. So,
Mr. Kustner, could I just ask a question?
Sure.
Paragraph 3 on page 5, I'm not sure the intent of that. I'm not quite seeing where that's going and why. Taking the same position the second time around would seem, why would we need to authorize that?
I don't know if it does require an express authorization. Again, this was just provided for greater certainty. There was a concern expressed by a number of the parties who played by the rules, so to speak, didn't raise an issue in this hearing because their intention all along was to only raise it on a site or quadrant specific basis in the phase 2 hearing. The request was made just to clarify that they're not in any way prejudiced by virtue of having played by the rules and limiting their issue to a site or quadrant specific basis in phase 2.
A good idea.
Thank you. So just by way of conclusion, on page 30 of our closing submissions, based on the totality of the evidence that you heard at this phase 1 hearing, it's our respectful submission, excuse me, that the secondary plan, the zoning bylaw, and the related policies in the Part 1 plan, with the proposed modifications that were recommended by staff and endorsed by council, and with the further modifications arising from settlements with various other parties, should all be approved in accordance with the draft order that we've provided and subject to the rights reserved by various parties in relation to the matters that remain to be adjudicated in phase 2 as noted in that draft order. It's our submission that the proposed Part 1 policies, the proposed secondary plan policies, and the proposed zoning provisions firstly are consistent and in conformity with the relevant land use planning, transportation, urban design, and other policies prescribed in higher order policies and plans at the provincial level. That includes the 2020 PPS, the 2019 Growth Plan, the Greenbelt Plan, the Oak Ridges Marine Conservation Plan, and also have due regard to the relevant matters of provincial interest under Section 2 of the Planning Act. Second, they conform with the approved regional official plan, as well as the emerging regional policy direction respecting NTSAs and planning for appropriate intensification on a region-wide basis. Third, they are in conformity with the guiding in-force policies in the city's Part 1 plan as proposed to be amended. They're consistent with best practices within the context of a major intensification area within the Greater Toronto Area. Fourthly, they recognize and duly implement the city's obligation under provincial plans and policies to provide for intensification within its centers and corridors, including a strategy for implementation of the regional and Part 1 OP objective to provide for a minimum of 35% affordable housing. Lastly, they constitute good planning for the Yonge Bernard KDA and the city as a whole, and they represent an appropriate balancing of competing interests and are in the broader public interest. And just as a final note, Mr. Chair, I wanted to advise the tribunal that once we have this panel's decision on the merits of these appeals, and without regard to the specific outcome of that decision, I have been instructed to bring a motion for partial recovery of the city's costs of this hearing as against one party, NEC, based on the conduct that unduly prolonged this hearing to the unnecessary expense of the public, the residents, and all other private parties. It is a persistent pattern of conduct that, in my respectful submission, ticks off virtually all of the boxes in terms of this tribunal's criteria for awarding costs. And on that basis, the city will be seeking leave to bring a motion for its partial costs at the appropriate time. Subject to any questions, those are my submissions. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm so sorry. I should know this by now, right? Forgive me. I just had one quick question on the way through on page 30 in your conclusion. The second bullet, is it not sort of difficult to say that they will conform with future emerging policy direction? Or are you just saying in general?
It's the latter, Madam Chair. I don't believe, in my submission, I don't believe that the secondary plan as proposed is subject to a test of conformity with emerging policy because it's not in-force policy. But based on the evidence that you heard from Ms. Anderson and the other planners who testified, it's our submission that in a general sense, it is consistent or in conformity with what appears to be that emerging policy direction. And it certainly does not preclude appropriate implementation of that policy regime based on the evidence that Ms. Anderson provided. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. The region?
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chair. I'm prepared to proceed. I have circulated earlier an electronic version of my written submissions, and the city has indicated that they would be kind enough to print hard copies for the panel. I don't know if you want to wait for that to happen or you'd like me to proceed. I think a few parties have made that request.
Mr. Chair, if it assists, if we ended up taking a break now, the city could go and print the next few parties hard copies of their submissions.
Okay, fair enough.
Thank you, Mr. Kahar. It's appreciated.
15? Okay.
Mr. Chair, it's Mr. Annabelle. I apologize. I had my articling student distribute paper copies
Yes.
this morning. Did you get those?
Yes.
We met
did.
him.
Okay.
And-
Thank you so much.
And they are on the podium here in front of us
Thanks so much.
for distribution.
Thank you.
Did a great job.
Thank you.